Mr. Zupan is saying is what many of my Republican colleagues are saying. They usually phrase it a little bit differently, Mr. Zupan. They say, I am not a scientist, and I really don't know. But let me tell you, we just had a report, as Jane just indicated, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was a composite of thousands of studies from 40 countries around the earth. So let me be very clear where Mr. Zupan was not. A, I believe that climate change is very real. I believe it is caused by human activity. I believe it is already causing devastating problems in the United States of America and around the world. And I am scared to death about the report from the IPCC, where they say if we don't get our act together in 12 years, this planet will be suffering irreparable harm. That's the kind of planet we're going to be leaving to our kids, which will be increasingly uninhabitable and unhealthy. We need to take drastic action to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy. I am proud of being an author of one of the more comprehensive pieces of energy legislation, of bringing money into the state to move us to solar energy. We have got to take on the fossil fuel industry and Donald Trump, who are more concerned about the short-term profits of the oil industry and the coal industry than they are about the future of America.
So since he mentioned my name, I get to answer.
No, you don't.
No.
To the point of a carbon tax,
Yeah.
how do you ensure that it's not regressive?
What you can do is when you raise the money, you can bring it back into those communities that are impacted to make sure precisely that it is not a regressive tax. If there's anything I think that I stand for, and that we're not going to put the burdens of society on low income and working families who are struggling today. At a time of massive income and wealth inequality, it's going to be the people on top who are going to help us out of this problem.
All right, I'm about to give you guys a chance to talk to each other, and then it's in some ways, I guess, a little bit of a free-for-all. But let me tackle one more topic here before we do. So on trade and tariffs, Lawrence Zupan, you're not a fan of the U.S. trade policies that we have had. You'd like to have fewer policies. And Bernie Sanders, you're also not a fan of the trade policies that we've had with China, Central America, and Mexico. You've said that they have led to the loss of millions of jobs in the United States and also to destitution in other countries.
Sure that the VA has the doctors
and didn't fix the problems.
The doctors and the nurses work with Senator John McCain on that. Doctors and the nurses.
This perhaps is an area in which you and President Trump agree, although you have different reasons and different solutions.
Don't carry it too far.
President Trump has negotiated a new trade deal with Mexico and Canada, very creatively named the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It comes on the heels of significant import tariffs and retaliatory tariffs placed on all kinds of goods coming into and out of this country. How will you vote on the new version of NAFTA, and is it a good agreement?
Well, I don't know that. I think it will be altered by the time it gets through Congress. I believe that our past trade policies, as you indicate, have been a disaster. I think they've led to the loss of tens of thousands of manufacturing plants in this country, where large corporations, middle-sized corporations are shutting down here, going for cheap labor in China, Mexico, and other desperate countries where people are paid 50 cents an hour or $1 an hour. So we need to create trade policies that work for American workers, but also do not crush the poor people around the world. Among other things, my concern with Trump's kind of helter-skelter policies is that they lack the kinds of enforcement capabilities. You can have a piece of legislation, but if it's not enforceable, it doesn't mean anything at all.
Lawrence Zupan?
Well, after watching the last several administrations basically be a trade treaty doormat for most of the world, China, Japan, and Europe, I'm glad that someone at least is raising the question of equity in our trading partners. And I believe that what President Trump has done is he's put the world on notice that the previous treaties wherein we were taken advantage of and we didn't use our skills at negotiating nearly as well as they could have been used, those days are over. I'm glad that at last there's somebody sitting in the White House who's rolled up his sleeves and shown the world that there's actually a bicep left in America. And so that's a beginning for new trade treaty negotiations. And that's a beginning for success in negotiating. When the other side thinks you're weak and you're going to roll over, that's a formula for disaster, which is what we've experienced for the last 30 years. So the present tariff situation, I believe, is sort of like the guide wheels on the back of a bicycle when you're learning how to ride. And that after a certain point, we won't need those tariffs anymore because we will have normalized our trade relationships with the rest of the world. And the rest of the world will give the United States the proper respect it's deserved.
That concludes the first segment of the debate. When we come back, the candidates are going to have an opportunity to talk to each other, ask one another questions directly, and answer. This is the U.S. Senate debate live on VPR and Vermont PBS.
With the midterm elections just days away, watch the competition for the control of Congress on C-SPAN. See for yourself the candidates and the debates from key House and Senate races. Make C-SPAN your primary source for campaign 2018.
In a moment, we'll return to live coverage of the first of two debates taking place today between independent Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and his Republican opponent, Lawrence Zupan. The second debate is this evening. Very quickly, some of our other debate coverage live tonight. Debate in Kentucky's 6th U.S. House District. Republican Representative Andy Barr debates Democratic challenger Amy McGrath. Democrat Senator Joe Donnelly debates his two challengers, Republican Mike Braun and Libertarian Lucy Brenton, in Indiana's U.S. Senate race. They face off in the Toby Theater in Indianapolis live tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Eastern. And Wednesday, Republican Congressman Tom MacArthur debates Democratic challenger Andy Kim in New Jersey's 3rd District U.S. House race. And now back to the debate taking place in Vermont.
Candidates for U.S. Senate: Republican challenger Lawrence Zupan and independent incumbent Bernie Sanders. The candidates will now have an opportunity to ask each other questions. I want to remind you, questions should be 30 seconds, and they really do need to be questions. You'll get a chance to answer, and then there's a chance for a follow-up question and answer as well. We're going to start with Lawrence Zupan. Your question for Bernie Sanders.
The last time you ran for office, you missed 37 out of 38 votes one quarter and 115 out of 163 the rest of that year. How can you justify to the voters of Vermont such dereliction of duty? And how will it be believed that if you were reelected for the next 2 years, you will be making Vermonters a priority over your personal, political, and presidential goals?
As somebody who served as mayor of Burlington and the Congress for 16 years and now in the Senate for 12 years, I've always made Vermont my major priority. But as I think you know, what you forgot to tell people, I ran for President of the United States of America. And when you run for President of the United States of America, you got to get out of Vermont, and you got to get out of Washington. And you got to run all over the country to talk about the need for health care for all people, for raising the minimum wage to a living wage, to deal with the issues of climate change and a woman's right to choose. And in running all over the country, what I'm really proud of is that in many ways we have changed the political dialogue in America. That right now there is a broad consensus that we need a government that works for all of us and not just the 1%. And I'm proud of the role that I played. So obviously when you run for President of the United States, you're going to miss votes. But I made it my business, by the way, to come back to Washington when there were key votes, when my vote mattered.
So for the next 2 years, what will you be doing if you are reelected? Running for president or representing the people of Vermont?
That is a decision.
Or representing the people of Vermont?
That is, I always represent the people of Vermont. And when we talk about legislation that protects working people in this country, wherever I am, that benefits the people of Vermont.
Senator Sanders, a question for Lawrence Zupan.
I am very proud, Jane, to have a lifetime 100% pro-choice voting record. I must tell you that I get tired of many of my conservative colleagues who talk about getting the government off the backs of the people. We want to deregulate everything. But when it comes to a woman's right to control her own body, well, they think that state government and federal government should be right in there telling every woman in this country how she can control her own body, or whether she can control her own body. Mr. Zupan, do you believe that a woman has a right to control her own body, or should that be the federal government?
You know, knowing that you were going to ask me this question, I promised my wife that I would answer it after you answered the following question. How far outside a mother's womb does the baby's skull have to be before you would forbid?
Answer my
I'm answering
question.
it. I'm answering your question. If you don't like the answer, I'm sorry. How far outside the mother's womb does the baby have to be before you would forbid the doctor from puncturing its skull and vacuuming out its brains?
All right, good.
How
We've heard
far?
that rhetoric from Trump. And
How
a lot
far?
Of,
I
answer
have
your
no-
question. I am gathering that what you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you believe it is the government who should tell every woman in this country whether or not she's going to have an abortion or not.
I believe that this is a settled law in this country, and that by talking about abortion all the time, you are ignoring a bigger scandal that affects every woman, whether she's post or premenopausal. And that is the fact that women's health care in this country is a second-class status. Do you know that almost all biomedical research that's done and lab research is geared towards men because it's less expensive? If I am
All
the
right,
new,
I gather
if
you
I am
haven't-
new se- please don't interrupt me, Senator.
Well,
if I am the new senator, I will sponsor legislation that puts women on an equal footing with men for the important, all-consumingly important biomedical research. This is by far a more pressing issue for all the women of Vermont and all the women of America than the bygone conclusion about the issue of abortion.
The answer then, through the non-answer, is that you don't believe a woman should be able to make that decision. You believe the government should. And I got to tell you something. I respect people. I respect people who have different points of view, and I really do. Friends of mine have different points of view. But what I don't respect is the hypocrisy of conservatives saying, we want to deregulate, we want small government, we want to get government off the backs of the American people.
So two
But on this,
totally
can I-
different issues.
Can I finish,
Totally
please?
different issues.
Can I finish, please?
Okay.
But on this issue, somehow, government should tell every woman. Now, there are women who do not want to have an abortion. There are women who look at that option. It should not be the government that makes that decision. It should be the woman.
We should allow women not to be coerced into a binary choice where they either have to have an abortion or be forced into a life of poverty and lack. We should encourage, as a government and as a humane society, we should encourage all the wonderful other options that are available for women that people like Planned Parenthood and Bernie Sanders never tell the American people about, like adoption, like ministries that will help take care of these children. There are so many other options rather than abortion or poverty.
Another question for Senator Sanders, Lawrence Zupan.
Yes. I'm so glad you've been able to live the American dream to become a millionaire by selling your books on Amazon. What advice do you have for young Vermonters who would want to be a multimillionaire like you?
Well, unfortunately, I am not a multimillionaire, and I'll tell you how you could do it. I grew up in a family that did not have a lot of money, and we wrote a book. I wrote a book. It's called Our Revolution. You should read it. It's a pretty good book. It was number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list, translated to 5 or 6 languages, sold all over the world. And you know what? When you write a best-selling book, you actually make some money. And I did. And I'm not ashamed of the fact that I wrote a book that talked about how we revitalize American democracy and was very specific about ideas about how we can create an economy and a government and a healthcare system that works for all. So in that narrow sense, Mr. Zupan, you can become a millionaire, I suppose, if you write a best-selling book. That's what I did.
So a book about our revolution, I would like to encourage everyone who read your book to also read the history of the American Revolution, much of its glorious history having occurred right here in Vermont and nearby. And my contention is that the first American Revolution, which declared that we have the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and which gave rise to the United States Constitution and the most successful country in the history of the world, that first American Revolution, my dear fellow Vermonters, gave us everything we need, and that Senator Sanders' reinvention of the word revolution to describe the post-Marxist ideas where government takes over everything and in its infinite wisdom redistributes to everybody else is not revolutionary at all. It's regressionary. The United States of America has fed, housed, clothed,